No, all the blemishes are there. You know, you see your life flash before your eyes just before you pass away. I don't think I'm dead yet.
Most people recognize Jon Bon Jovi as the charismatic frontman who led one of rock's most enduring bands to global stardom. But beneath that confident, larger-than-life persona, a series of unsettling secrets, surprising revelations, and quiet tragedies have shaped his reality. Even as he blazed through sold-out arenas and topped music charts with anthem after anthem, he was privately wrestling with battles that threatened to tear him apart, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Some rumors point to health struggles that shattered his once commanding voice, while others highlight the relentless toll of heartbreak and betrayal that built up over decades. Ultimately, these hidden chapters reveal a complex story of resilience, ambition, and survival. Jon Bon Jovi's journey begins in a working-class neighborhood of Sayreville, New Jersey in the early 1960s. Born John Francis Bongiovi Jr., he was raised by parents who were both former Marines. Discipline, fortitude, and resilience were themes ingrained in him from childhood. But what really set him apart was his fascination with music. He was that kid who rarely missed a chance to sing in talent shows or local performances. If there was a band practice happening within a mile radius, you could count on him to be there, absorbing every nuance of stagecraft. Still, ambition often requires more than raw talent. As John approached his teenage years, he formed his first makeshift band, dubbed Rays, using any equipment he could borrow or scrounge up. Small-time gigs at school events and local clubs fueled his hunger. He believed, without a shred of doubt, that he was destined for bigger stages. Around 16, he set up another group with his friend David Bryan, planting the earliest seeds of what would eventually become one of rock's most recognizable bands. But the music industry in the late 1970s and early 1980s was cutthroat. Record labels had gatekeepers who insisted that another rock act wasn't likely to succeed. John faced repeated rejections, often delivered in curt letters or brief phone calls telling him his voice wasn't distinctive enough, or that guitar-driven rock was already saturated. Each refusal was a blow. Yet somehow, he refused to let cynicism overpower him. He took odd jobs, including janitorial work at a recording studio, as a way to stay close to the environment he longed to be part of. And then, in a stroke of luck, fueled by undying persistence, he convinced a local DJ to play one of his recordings, Runaway. The track found an unexpected audience, gaining local traction at a rate that took everyone by surprise. Almost overnight, that modest level of radio play led to interest from producers who had once turned him away. It would turn out to be a turning point. John finally had a modest platform he could leverage into something bigger, but even that glimpse of opportunity didn't instantly solve his troubles. He yearned for a stable lineup of musicians who understood his vision. So he called in David Bryan for keyboard duties, Tico Torres for drums, Alec John Such for bass, and Richie Sambora as lead guitarist. They emerged in the early 1980s under the banner Bon Jovi. From the outside, it seemed like a natural union, a group of hungry musicians with talent, hustle, and attitude. Few people realized how much adversity and near-starvation level sacrifice they would endure before anyone beyond the Jersey music scene paid serious attention. Still, as soon as Runaway gained traction, the band members launched themselves into every possible performance opportunity. They barely slept. They traveled in cramped vans. Their equipment was often second-hand. Yet the camaraderie and shared dreams kept them afloat. Nobody could guess that behind the early excitement, they were constantly teetering on the edge of collective burnout. But that's only a fraction of what shaped John's story. Early exposure to how brutal and unforgiving the music scene could be laid the groundwork for battles far more intense than simple rejection. Bolstered by the modest success of Runaway, Bon Jovi secured a record deal and quickly released their self-titled debut album in 1984. Although it didn't blow up the charts, It confirmed that the band had a loyal and growing fan base. What really pushed them into mainstream territory was their third album, Slippery When Wet, 1986. Featuring hits like You Give Love a Bad Name and Livin' on a Prayer, this album exploded worldwide, topping charts and filling massive venues. Suddenly, the band was everywhere. Magazine covers, popular TV shows, radio countdowns. They embarked on tours that seemed never-ending, taking them from small bars in the tri-state area to sold-out stadiums around the globe. To outsiders, it was the stuff of legend. Rags to riches, determined underdogs who'd taken over the airwaves. For the group, however, the story was more complicated. Success fueled expectations. Fans wanted another record and then another, and each release had to be bigger, bolder, and more polished than the last. John, as the face of the band, felt constant pressure from all sides. Record labels demanded hits. Bandmates sought a fair share of creative input. Media outlets clamored for interviews and personal tidbits about his life. Every time he stepped off stage, someone else stepped in with fresh demands. For a while, he carried the load with a smile. After all, stardom was exactly what he'd worked so hard to achieve. But behind that confident smile, an internal battle was brewing. John was a perfectionist, a trait that allowed him to refine every performance but also made it hard for him to loosen his grip. Even then, some close friends noticed signs of strain, a hint of anxiety here, a flash of temper there. Over the next few albums, New Jersey, 1988, and beyond, the band solidified their place in rock history. Fans lined up overnight for tickets, album sales soared, and it seemed like the party would never end. Yet, everything comes at a cost, and for Bon Jovi, that cost was the mounting exhaustion and emotional turmoil that simmered behind the glitz. At first, those external pressures were overshadowed by the adrenaline rush of performing. It's electrifying to walk on stage and hear thousands of fans roaring back at you. But once the lights dimmed and the amps were turned off, the grim reality often crept in. John felt a responsibility to hold everyone together. He was the frontman, the founder, the central pillar. The idea of taking a break or stepping back carried its own fears. What if momentum was lost? What if fans moved on to the next big thing? Despite the exhaustion creeping in, the band kept saying yes to extended tours, TV appearances, and marketing campaigns. They wanted to capitalize on the wave of success. John, unwavering leader that he was, tried to be everything to everyone. What the public didn't realize was that this unrelenting schedule was sowing seeds of emotional and physical collapse. And like all seeds, those seeds would eventually bear fruit. Fruit that was bitter and heavy. As Bon Jovi powered through one demanding tour cycle after another, emotional cracks began to reveal themselves in John's life. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the band was at the peak of its powers. Yet, for all their success, they operated under a suffocating strain. John, in particular, carried a double burden. Not only did he have to sing, perform, and often write the songs, he also felt compelled to manage much of the band's business dealings. The combined weight of these responsibilities began to crush him. He kept telling himself that he just needed to push through a little bit longer, that the next day off would be the relief he needed. Each time, he discovered that the next day off wasn't truly a day off. It involved more interviews, more promotional events, and more decisions that would affect not just his future, but the livelihoods of his bandmates. Before long, he was locked in a punishing cycle: perform, handle business tasks, try to rest, fail to rest, repeat. Sometimes, after a show, he'd collapse onto a sofa backstage, too fatigued to remove his stage clothes. Voices around him swirled with demands and obligations. Even when he found a moment of quiet, his mind raced with everything that still needed attention. Some nights, the despair grew so intense that John privately flirted with the idea of offing himself, an unthinkable notion for the man who always seemed so lively and determined. According to interviews he gave years later, he once sat in a moving car on the Pacific Coast Highway and wondered if jumping out was an escape from the emotional agony closing in around him. This terrifying mental snapshot reveals how dire things had become. During one particularly grueling tour, the worst eventually happened. With stadium lights blazing and thousands of fans screaming in anticipation, John started to feel lightheaded just a few songs into the performance. His legs felt oddly weak, and he was gulping for air sooner than usual. He pushed on, refusing to let fans see his struggle, but the tipping point arrived faster than he could adapt. Mid-set, he collapsed. Stunned band members and security rushed over, leading him off stage as the crowd watched in helpless confusion. For a moment, the cheers gave way to stunned silence. Backstage, medics checked his vital signs. It was painfully clear that his energy reserves had finally hit zero. In the wake of that onstage collapse, he had no choice but to confront a frightening truth. He could no longer keep running on fumes. The tour eventually concluded, but not without leaving significant scars on his psyche. Even though the collapse made headlines, few understood the deeper emotional spiral John had been battling. It turned out that he wasn't just physically drained, he was mentally teetering on the edge. Yet, in a strange twist, this collapse turned into a small window of opportunity, an unsettling wake-up call that convinced him he needed a genuine break. That break, however, unveiled other conflicts that had long been brewing among band members. Time off from touring was supposed to be a healing period for Bon Jovi, but the fragmentation within the band only grew more apparent. Tensions that had simmered unnoticed for years now rose to the surface. Chief among these simmering issues was the evolving relationship between John and Richie Sambora. From the outside, John and Richie seemed like the perfect creative duo. One, with the vocal power and business savvy, the other with extraordinary guitar skills and an intuitive grasp of songwriting. They produced hits that defined an era. Fans came to see them almost as siblings, or at the very least as two sides of the same artistic coin. But beneath the smiles and stage chemistry, a quieter storm was brewing. Richie yearned for input beyond guitar solos. He had musical ideas, lyrical notions, and personal ambitions that went beyond the persona of the guitarist in Bon Jovi. Meanwhile, John, feeling the immense weight of fronting and steering the band, became even more controlling about the band's direction. Adding to the friction were personal struggles. For Richie, the relentless touring exacerbated his substance issues, and he also missed spending time with his daughter. As his priorities shifted toward family and wellness, the band's never-ending schedule clashed with what he felt was a necessary slowdown. The final crack came in 2013, during the band's Because We Can tour. One day, Richie simply didn't appear on stage. Fans in Calgary were puzzled. Wild rumors rippled through online forums. Had he been fired? Was he ill? Was there a last-minute emergency? When the dust settled, the most shocking possibility turned out to be true. He had quit, walking away from an 80-date tour midstream. John was furious, feeling blindsided in the middle of a high-profile schedule. Publicly, he framed Richie's exit as a refusal to work, suggesting it was unfair to the band and their supporters. Richie countered that his departure was self-preservation. He was burned out, worried about relapsing, and longing for a semblance of normalcy with his daughter. Suddenly, the once inseparable partners found themselves airing dirty laundry through interviews and social media hints. John lamented the betrayal. Richie insisted on his right to choose family over an industry machine. For fans, the heartbreak was palpable. Bon Jovi's cohesive force had always seemed unbreakable, and now it stood fractured, leaving many wondering if the band could ever regain its former magic. A few years later, during the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2018, Richie returned to perform with Bon Jovi for one nostalgic evening. Hopes soared for a full-fledged reunion, but it turned out to be a one-time event. Ritchie remained steadfast in his choice to stay apart from the rigorous demands of the band. Jon moved forward, but not without carrying lingering hurt and a sense that one of his life's cornerstones had been carved away. Little did anyone suspect that this episode, wrenching as it was, wouldn't be the last major difficulty on Jon Bon Jovi's horizon. Another battle lay just ahead, one that threatened to silence the voice that had carried him through decades of triumph and torment. For much of his career, Jon Bon Jovi's voice was a powerhouse. Songs like "Livin' on a Prayer" and "Bed of Roses" hinged on those soaring vocals that ignited massive sing-alongs night after night. By the early 2020s, however, fans began noticing a troubling shift. Jon sometimes lowered the key of classic hits during live shows, or he delegated, challenging passages to backing vocalists. At first, many attributed these changes to the natural effects of aging. Singers in their 50s and 60s often adapt their vocal range, yet the deviations from his former style felt more pronounced. Observers noted him struggling to hold notes, sounding winded sooner, and occasionally going off-pitch in ways that seemed more than just an off night. Whispers of serious vocal strain grew louder. Some critics claimed he was either in denial or reluctant to reveal the real problem. He performed a show in Nashville that brought these concerns to a head. Videos from that performance circulated quickly online, with viewers commenting on how different, even uncomfortable his voice seemed. It wasn't merely the public's reaction that rattled him. His wife, Dorothea, candidly pointed out afterward that something was clearly wrong. The next day, plagued by doubt and worry, Jon sought medical advice. The diagnosis was chilling. For any singer, vocal atrophy, a condition in which the vocal folds weaken over time, making it increasingly hard to sustain or reach certain notes. It can be caused by prolonged strain, lack of rest, and even underlying nerve issues. Facing this reality sent Jon into an emotional tailspin. Singing wasn't just part of his job, it formed his identity. The thought of losing it cut deeper than any band feud or career setback could. Despite his reluctance, doctors stressed the need for immediate intervention if he wanted to preserve what remained of his vocal strength. In 2022, he underwent a delicate surgery known as vocal fold medialization. This procedure can help reinforce weak parts of the vocal cords, potentially improving a singer's control and range. Recovery demanded strict protocols, daily vocal exercises, rest periods, and frequent checkups with specialists. Jon also had to focus on breathing techniques, carefully warming up his voice before performances, and pacing himself to avoid recurrence. Concessions were made in the band's schedule, too. Gone were the days of back-to-back marathon tours, without pause. If he wanted to keep performing, he had to adopt a more balanced, cautious strategy. It might have seemed like a straightforward process, but the stakes were enormous. One misstep could derail his progress. He found an unexpected ally in Shania Twain, another artist who had endured vocal surgeries after suffering nerve damage. Her story gave him hope that coming back strong was possible, even if it required rethinking how to sing and perform. By mid-2024, Jon tentatively returned to live stages. Audiences noticed that his voice carried a different texture. Not necessarily worse, just altered. The real test came when the band released their 16th studio album, Forever, commemorating 40 years in the music industry. Critics praised it for sincerity and resilience, though they couldn't ignore the vocal shifts. Jon was pushing forward, but there was no denying that every note now came with a measure of risk. Yet, this vocal nightmare wasn't the only health trial he faced around this time. Another crisis, tied to a global pandemic, arrived to complicate his already fragile situation. In late 2021, at a fan event in Miami, Jon Bon Jovi tested positive for COVID-19 just moments before stepping on stage. Although he was fully vaccinated and only exhibited mild symptoms, the immediate concern was how the virus might exacerbate his already precarious vocal condition. COVID-19 is known to cause respiratory inflammation, sometimes leading to lingering lung or throat complications. During his period of isolation, he worried about whether this virus would further erode his vocal cords, especially since he was already grappling with vocal atrophy. He had just begun a series of specialized voice therapies to strengthen what remained of his range, and now, mandatory quarantine threatened to undo any progress he had made. Even after he recovered, fans and critics noticed that his live performances took another dip. Breathing control and vocal resonance, two essential components of singing, often remain vulnerable after COVID-19. For a vocalist already learning how to navigate newly adjusted vocal cords, the timing couldn't have been worse. Still, Jon refused to let the diagnosis corner him into retirement. He approached recovery with the same grit that propelled him through rejections in his youth. Vocal exercises were intensified, consultations with vocal coaches became more frequent, and doctors examined potential post-COVID complications. With each checkup, he adapted more rigorous rehabilitation techniques, gradually fine-tuning a voice that now needed careful stewardship. The emotional stakes were towering. Jon had already lost crucial band members, weathered personal betrayals, and wrestled with mental distress. Adding a chronic or permanent vocal impairment to the list felt like a final, punishing blow. But his resilience held firm. Slowly, he began weaving in small, carefully managed performances, each serving as both a test and a statement of defiance. By 2024, he had embraced a measured approach, scheduling fewer, more spaced-out concerts, often in smaller venues where the pressure to belt out high-octane songs was more manageable. Critics and fans alike acknowledged the difference in his voice, but many applauded his dedication. After all, how many artists continue performing under such daunting medical obstacles? If you like this video, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more.